This green line, basically the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, to the Mississippi River, which is as far as the English claims went, is now going to be reserved for the native people. And the American colonists are not to go past that line. This is deeply angering to the American people. Do you remember the Ohio Company that I talked about last time? That group from Alexandria who is planning on moving east. It's planters from the Washingtons, the Madisons, this group in here in Alexandria. They had their eyes on the Ohio River Valley. Put down, if you would, that this especially angers the planter elites, the landed elite of America, the wealthy landed elites who see the wealth of the next generation coming out of Western expansion. It also bothers the average American colonists who might have wanted to move out west. So one of my themes here is that the American Revolution is unusual. It's not going to be like the French Revolution. The French Revolution is going to be the propertyless people trying to get rights and property for themselves by attacking the first and second estates. That's the French Revolution. Ours is weird. Our revolution is led by the propertied people of the South. People like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, planters that's an unusual revolution. The other ones that get involved in this revolution are going to be commercial elite, like John Hancock. It's an unusual one. But why do the British do this? It is thought that they did this because the Americans, when the British over in Parliament realized if they don't prevent the Americans from moving in there, the Americans will move in there, and that land, which is worth a lot of money, will end up in American hands, and they'll make the money from it. So Britain wants to hold up on that until Britain can figure out a way to make money on this Western expansion. So it's really not about the Native Americans, it's about how can we in England make sure the Americans don't get all this land for themselves. This is George III. He's the king who we're going to just send our divorce papers to. You'll remember that his grandfather, George I, came from Hamburg. He couldn't speak English. The grandfather couldn't. And we had prime ministers who ran things for all during George I, all during the George II's lifetime. George III's first one born in England, grows up speaking English, grows up with English lords. And during his reign, he tries to take back power from Parliament. People in Parliament who disagree with this, House of Lords are pretty much down with it, but within the House of Commons, there's a bunch of people who are opposed to this, and I do not remember why they call themselves this, but they call themselves the Whigs.
Do they wear wigs?
They all wore wigs. I think maybe they didn't wear wigs. I don't know, because I don't think I see... I don't know why. You would think that it has something to do with the wigs that were worn commonly by men at the time, but I can't remember. Because when we see Thomas Paine here in a bit, I don't think he's wearing a wig. So there's a group of angry parliamentarians who think that George's effort to take power to himself is him moving them back towards absolute monarchy, which they don't want any part of. The English have achieved too much to let this now king undermine their democracy, not democracy, this constitutional monarchy. All right, but your first ID, or your next ID, is Lord Grenville. He is the finance minister of England. It's a more complicated name, like Lord Exchequer or something. I can't remember how you say it. He's the finance minister. He's the guy who's got to figure out, he's in charge of getting the revenue is collected, and then he has the revenue spent, writes the checks. He's got a problem on his hands. On his desk is a mountain of bonds. Bonds are the government borrowed money, and they've got a pledge to pay these things back a certain time period. Well, they're beginning to come due. These bonds are the debt from the 7 Years' War. All during those 7 years, England didn't have enough current revenue to pay for the war, so they borrowed money. from European bankers. And now it's time to pay the debt back, that unfun moment when the vacation's over, right? All right, so he needs new revenue. We're going to get new revenue. You're going to have to raise taxes, right? So you go to Parliament and say, we need more money. And Parliament says, well, why not tax us? We paid enough. Who do they want to tax?
Colonies.
Let's tax the colonies. They never pay for anything. We went and saved the American colonies from France. We went through great expense in this war. They should now start ponying up the money. If you're American, would you? What was that?
And they can't really complain.
Yeah, what are they going to do about it? What kind of argument would you make, first of all, with regard to the idea that the French have benefited us, the British have benefited the Americans by going to war with France? How might that argument be countered somewhat?
I feel like they mostly just wanted the land and weren't doing it for the people at the 13 colonies.
Well, that right there. If they hadn't done that, maybe the Americans would have been a little bit more.
Talking about the Indian Reserve.
Yeah, well, because all this territory up there is just, I mean, the Americans really aren't getting access to it, are they? So they really done us no favor by defeating the French. I mean, maybe security issues. But if our point was we didn't want the French there because we wanted to go there, now we can't go there, the English argument's kind of fallen down. So what he comes up with several different, by the way, these acts are passed in Parliament over in London. He gets a tax on sugar to the colonies. Colonies import sugar from the Caribbean. Those are British Isles. Will tax them on all the sugar they're buying. Then he gets kind of ingenious, and he comes up with what might be the first sales tax, really. He wants to tax commercial transactions with the Stamp Act. This is your ID, the Stamp Act. Any paper that enters into the public domain in the colonies, whether it's newspapers, all newspapers would have to have a little stamp on it. Where do you get the stamp at? The publisher of the newspaper goes down to the British tax stamp office, pays them so much money, I guess maybe a third of a shilling for every newspaper. You get a whole bunch of these things, give them the money, and you go back to your print shop and you start putting these stamps on there. Now, you pass that cost on to the consumer, right? They've got to now pay that little bit extra money. So basically, he's made the newspaper publishers into tax collectors. Kind of like today, we've made all of our retailers into tax collectors, which is an ingenious idea. The other thing is, if you've got a deed that you're going to go to the courthouse and maybe get a piece of land, well, there'd be a much larger stamp required for that, some kind of percentage of the value of what's being traded or involved in this deed. Well, the Americans hate this thing. We've paid taxes here, but we've raised taxes to pay for our own things. We've paid our own way over here, so to speak. I want to mention this too. It turns out Americans don't like to pay taxes. And over in the Carolinas, the Low Country, I think it was North Carolina actually, today it's Raleigh, but I don't think Raleigh was the capital then. But they had a lot of problems when they would send tax collectors out here to what is basically East Tennessee. They would get run off. They'd get shot at. Same thing happened up in Pennsylvania. One of these groups is called the Paxton Boys. The other one's called the Regulators. I can't remember which one's which. But up in Pennsylvania, when Philadelphia would try to send tax collectors out to Pennsylvania, they'd get run off by the Americans. So keep that in the background as we see where this is headed. This is Patrick Henry. Anybody know anything associated with Patrick Henry with regard to this debate over taxes?
Okay, I was like, give me liberty.
Somebody else says, give me liberty, give me death. Who is that?
Oh, if it's not him, I have.
I can't remember who it is. What's that? No taxation without representation. The colonies have gotten so mad that they're calling special sessions of their legislatures to pass laws, to pass resolutions condemning this policy. Patrick Henry comes up with a little phrase that just everybody, kind of takes the colonies. Here, bear this in mind. It's a political argument. This is a time of the Enlightenment. We've been talking about political ideas since John Locke's Second Treatise on Government in 1670? What are the rights of individuals? We've been burnishing or giving real credence to this idea that we have rights. So he says we English have the right to not be taxed unless we're represented. And we're not represented in Parliament in England. Therefore, you can't tax us. What do the English say? Pretty much screw you. They do the Declaratory Act, which is your next ID. The Americans are saying it's not legal for England to tax the colonists like this. So England passes an act. London Parliament passes an act declaring, called the Declaratory Act is, I guess, because it's a declaration. Here's a declaration. The English Parliament has a right to legislate. The English Parliament has a right to legislate, that is to pass laws, with regard to the colonies on all matters whatsoever. So the English Parliament has a right to legislate on behalf of the colonies on all matters whatsoever. For the last 100-something years, the English colonies have been practicing self-rule. There's been a very light hand by England on our operations. They did pass those navigation acts, but they weren't really enforcing very much. They did do the Wool Act, but that did bother us, but we also ignored that as much as possible. The Steel Act was a recent one. I don't think we've gotten around that one yet. So they've just given themselves the right. The Americans say you don't have the right. England just gave itself the right. Does that satisfy the Americans? It does not satisfy the Americans. And so the Americans start attacking British tax collectors. This is a British tax collector, evidently. Could have been an American who was collecting taxes on behalf of the British. He has been beaten up. He's been stripped naked. He's had, I don't know if he's naked or not. He's then had hot pitch poured on him, like tar, and then put feathers on him and run out of town. And that's the American response to England. Things are escalating. Have you heard of escalation, right? When things escalate? Well, now England could decide that we're really serious and maybe they had to negotiate, right? But England didn't do it. England decides they're going to go the other way. And so the Mutiny Act, it's not up there, but I believe it's your next one, is called the Mutiny Act. The British now send troops to protect their tax collectors. And they also send ships to start patrolling the coast for smugglers. They're coming down on the Americans. We're going to collect these taxes. We're going to enforce the navigation acts. We're going to have to send troops in to do it. It's costing us more money, and therefore you Americans are going to have to pay for the cost of these people. And they passed something called the Quartering Act, which allowed the commanders who are arriving with troops to go up to an American house in a city and say, you're going to take 2 of my men and you're going to house them and they're going to live with you guys, you're going to feed them. And you folks here are going to do this. It would disperse troops among the civilian population. Not very. Americans don't like this. But they've come in big force. And so we are not ready for a straight up armed conflict with them. Plus it's our own government. It's not like it's a foreign government, or it is kind of a foreign. Increasingly, in 1763, America and Britain, we just won the French Indian War. We're together. What a great people we are. But this is all ruining the relationship, this contest over taxing the American colonies. This is not an ID for you, but a very important thing that begins to happen is the American colonies begin to talk to each other. And this thing called the Committees of Correspondence, where is he? Sam Adams. He's over here somewhere. Heard of Sam Adams? Where did he go to? There he is. Sam Adams. Do you know what his occupation was? A brewer, that's right. He brewed ales up. And then today we still have Sam Adams, Winter Longer or Oktoberfest or whatever. So Sam Adams is an important brewer in Boston. Pretty wealthy, commercial, making money off commerce and that whole commercial setting in Boston. He's well educated and he emerges as one of the organizers of the resistance to England. And this is when Boston begins to distinguish itself. Boston gets way ahead of all the other Americans. They're just getting really angry up there. I guess they have a stronger sense of independence. By the way, this is not the Boston of the Puritan age. This is a different Boston, 100 and something years later. All right, to go back to the committees of correspondence, Sam Adams starts thinking, we better reach out to other colonies and maybe we can make a united front, a united response to England. And so he finds the names of like-minded men in Virginia and North Carolina. Like, here's Virginia, this is Thomas Jefferson. He finds out there's this Thomas Jefferson guy down there. He's been making statements. Patrick Henry down in Virginia, obviously. So they start communicating with each other, writing letters, sending newspaper articles. This eventually is going to give birth to a really important body called the Continental Congress. It is going to be a group, it's going to be, it's invoked. We talk about the French Revolution in a little while, and the invoking of representative body that has as its sovereign the people. Boy, that's a new idea in a new age. We don't think about it at all, but this is where our modern age came from, is decisions made by these people at this time, given the political views that they had. I'll come back to the Continental Congress a little later. So, this event, things kind of 68 to 72, things are simmering. What's this event? The Boston Massacre, and we're up in Boston again. March, like 5th, 1772. A group of angry Bostonians. There was an economic downturn. A lot of them were out of work, frustrated. They're actually angry at some of the British soldiers who were going out and getting jobs when they were off duty. And that's just one more thing they were angry at the British for. One morning, there's a squad in this square, and some angry Bostonians start hurling insults at them first. And then they start throwing something else at them. It's March. Of course, the story is what? That we were just throwing snowballs, right? Started off with snowballs, but it was probably chunks of ice, which is basically rocks, and unfair in most snowball fights, if I recall correctly. The commander gets his squad formed up. He feels under assault. He tells the crowd to disperse. Another one of his men get hit. He's bleeding out of his head. He thinks maybe there's been a shot. It's really loud in there, and so he has his squad fire on the unarmed. Are they unarmed? Basic. They're going to have to leave the square. Non-lethal weapons, right? They could have left. They could have left the square maybe, I don't know, come back. But he was going to stand his ground, killing 5 Bostonians and wounding many others. Now this, Boston itself is up in arms. They're really angry. This is an occupying army now killing our civilians. Which is not a very good idea. You never win over the hearts and minds by doing that of the people. There is a trial of these guys. They actually get off for having felt that they were under duress. How about this moment in Boston? Here we are in Boston again, the big one. The Boston Tea Party. What's this about? What's that? Yeah, tax on tea. There's a new tax. It's on tea, and it's got a monopoly. So this is a group called, I don't have it on your ID list, but just to let you know, they're called the Sons of Liberty. They appear in Assassin's Creed, evidently. 3. Assassin's Creed 3, maybe. The Sons of Liberty. Liberty, man. Our rights as individuals. We're going to stand up for them. So the Sons of Liberty are a group of Bostonian men who have had enough, and they are prepared to start fighting back against the British and harassing the British. I guess we would call this an insurgency. It's a brewing insurgency. By the way, the leaders of the Minutemen, of this Sons of Liberty are Sam Adams and John Hancock. John Hancock is one of the most wealthy men in America. His money has been made on trade. and all of this stuff going on with the British policies is ruining his business too. So British policies have ruined both commercial peoples like John Hancock and their future, and it's undermining the landed elite. Normally, governments reflect the interests of the propertied people. That's just how it is. The wealthy usually are in the driver's seat. But this is weird. Our wealthy are in the driver's seat in our area, right? Who's in the driver's seat? The British wealthy. And their British wealthy, British business interests are not the same as our wealthy. And that's where this is going. So now what happens here in 1774, I believe it's, or maybe 73, that part. The Sons of Liberty go down on into the wharf, get on the boats where the new tea has come in, and what do they do with it? They just throw it overboard, right? Screw you guys, we don't want the stuff anyway. What are they dressed up as?
Indians.
Native American, yeah. Why do you think they did that? Do these guys down here know who they are, do you think?
Yeah.
They probably do. They're probably cheering them on. Who's going to be coming down to the wharf pretty soon? We don't see them there now.
Probably the British soldiers?
Yeah, the troops are going to be coming down here in a minute. And these guys are going to have to do the Assassin's Creed thing and like scale the walls and get out of there really quick. By dressing up as Native Americans, they are able to give, you've done this with your parents, plausible deniability. Right? You can say, we don't know who they were. They were a bunch of Native Americans. We couldn't tell. Now and that's what happens. The British troops get there, they say, who did this? They're like, I don't know. A bunch of Native Americans did this. And they're all laughing. And so this is kind of the final straw for the British. They're going to now bring the hammer down on Boston. And that's your next ID. It's called the Coercive Acts. Coercion is to cause someone pain, to change the way they behave. Maybe having your allowance revoked or your phone taken away or whatever. No car for the weekend. Or in this case, about 4 things they do. England passes the Coercive Act, which is a series of acts just designed for Boston. Because Boston is at the tip of the spear here. They are the ones who are pushing the most. They're the ones who are getting truly unruly. Number 1, they suspend home rule. No more home rule for you guys. That had been a privilege, is what England says. We gave you the privilege of governing yourselves for the last 150 years. Your legislature is shut down. We don't need any lawmakers anymore because you're not making any more laws for yourself. They removed the governor of Massachusetts. They send a British admiral to be the new governor of Massachusetts. So he'll be a military governor. No more civilian trials for accused patriots. Terrorists. I'm sure that's what they called them. Because if you tried to, let's say if the British maybe knew who these guys were and brought them into a trial by jury, that would be the Bostonians, right? Would the Bostonians find these guys guilty? They would not. So they suspend civilian trials and they say, well, we'll take care of this by military tribunals. So now the British soldiers are doing police work. They're looking for the Sons of Liberty. They're looking for John Hancock. He's gone into hiding. Sam Adams, not in his, they're hiding. They've got a shadow government, we call it. If a soldier grabs somebody he thinks is a Minutemen, that's coming next. A Sons of Liberty, you can bring them before a tribunal and they're like, yeah, we agree with you. If they bring you in, chances are you're going to go into one of their jails, which is a ship they've converted in the Boston Harbor to hold these political rebels. Okay, so are the Bostons going to succumb to this coercion? Or not? Now, we have also in this year the first important meeting of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In response to what's happened to Boston, the American colonists decide that they need to stand together. And so delegates are sent from each colony to meet in Philadelphia, which was kind of in the middle. And in Philadelphia, they proclaimed themselves to be the Continental Congress. We are acting on the American people, behalf of the American people. You should listen to us, England, because we represent the American people. And we're distinct people. And they send a letter to King George saying, we don't know if you know how bad your government is dealing with us, but we beg upon you to please change policies here. Get new ministers, and let's go to fair ground. That letter is ignored. Oh, we also say the Coercion Act is absolutely improper. I mean, you cannot do that. The right of the American people to govern themselves is our right, and it cannot be taken away. It is not a privilege. It is a right. So, meanwhile, the next escalation is for the Sons of Liberty in Boston to reach out more into the Massachusetts itself, outside into the countryside. And they start getting farmers and villagers are outside of Boston. You know, if you're willing to self-identify, we need to prepare for the moment when we're going to be fighting England. We're going to get there. We're going to have to fight for our rights. These rights are not, I guess, valid until we have to fight for them. So it's basically a paramilitary organization. They get organized. The Minutemen self-identify. They figure out who's got a little bit of military background, maybe from the French Indian War, who's going to be a commander, when they're supposed to show up, or what do they do when they show up. I guess that's what they looked like, perhaps. Now, if you were in American history class, I'd tell you, I'd give you the ID Lexington, but we're getting, I think Thomas Paine is next for you guys. In the city, the British are everywhere looking for Minutemen and also Sons of Liberty. And so the paramilitary group is collecting gunpowder for this coming likely war. And they've got it hidden outside of Boston because it's unsafe in Boston. The British might find it. The British have got some intelligence that tells them there is a large cache of gunpowder in a little town called Concord, about 13 miles outside of Boston. And on April 19th, 1775, early in the morning, a large, maybe a regiment of British soldiers leave Boston to go to Concord and try to do a surprise seize of it. And one of the Minutemen in Boston, this guy right here, you'll recognize him? Paul Revere. He's a craftsman, but he has self-identified as somebody who's willing to take a risk and begin to fight, if that's what it is. His job was to notify the alert system, to alert the Minutemen that the British were leaving and they should move the weapons. What was his job, do you remember? A lantern in a church tower. What was it, one if by?
And to the capacity.
Yep, he must have put one lantern up there, right? Because they were headed out by land. But he's worried that maybe the guy who's supposed to be on the lookout for this lantern might be asleep. And so he jumps on his horse and makes this ride. He's really crossed over and he's willing to do it. That does alert the Minutemen between Boston and Concord, and they decide to go to Lexington and make a stand at Lexington. The Minutemen are just going to try to slow up the British. And so when the British get to this town of Lexington, they find on the village green, on a bridge that they've got to go across, a bunch of Minutemen, and by the way, they brought their guns. And the British get up there and they confront them and they tell them to get off the bridge and let them pass through, and they're just trying to slow them up. The Americans say they're not getting off the bridge, and the British say, get off now, and they're like, not going to do it. And so the British form up for an attack, and the Americans get themselves together. It's a standoff, and then boom, gun goes off. Probably an American. They think it's probably American, got nervous or just messed up. It was coming anyway, but the British unload on the Americans. I don't remember if anyone's killed. I know many are wounded, and they march on to Concord. When they get to Concord, the weapons and gunpowder have been moved successfully, and now they got to go back to Boston. And that whole rest of the day they try to get back to Boston, the Minutemen have gone up. It's the spark that makes the whole wildfire start. The Minutemen from everywhere start converging on this road back to Boston, and they just shoot at the British all the way back from behind trees. They chase them all the way back into the city. And that is the beginning, really, of the Revolutionary War. Not all the states are doing it, or the colonies, but Massachusetts is up in arms over their rights. Then they get even crazy. Oh, I'll mention this now, too. 1775, second meeting of the Continental Congress. Very important decision they make at that Continental Congress. Again, they send a letter to the king saying all things as heretofore, pleading with him to give this consideration because where we're headed is not good. But the most important thing they do at the Continental Congress that year is they decide that they need to plan for a common defense. And so they decide to make a Continental Army, and they decide to choose someone to start organizing a Continental Army. Who volunteers? Well, who gets nominated? There you go. George Washington gets nominated, 40 years old. Some military background, not very, he's not well prepared for much of what he does on the battlefield, but he gets better later on. At any rate, he starts building a Continental Army, communicating with the different colonies about what we would do in defense in the event of war. Meanwhile, the Bostonians, they're not done. A group of Minutemen steal cannons from a fort about 20 miles away, bring it up across the harbor from Boston. It's called, know it as Bunker Hill. Breed's Hill is another name. Charlestown is it's got several names. But the British wake up one morning and they see these guys up on the hill working, and it's these Minutemen who have felled trees, made a palisade embankment, and put cannons up there and have guns. And they're like, come and get us. And these are just citizens of Boston who've had enough, and they're like, if we don't fight for our rights are gone. And so the British march up there and take it, and they tell each other, we're going to die, but we're going to fight for this. It's for our children and our children's children. This is who we are. It's really an amazing story about these, of course, patriots, as we call them, from Boston. Thomas Paine, ID for you. Not wearing a wig, but he is a wig. He is one of these he's a political activist in England who's upset at George. Very upset about the fact that these rights that we've been working on in England for the last couple of hundred years are being eroded. So he leaves England and comes to America. He wants to go and join up where liberty is making a stand. He is credited, his small pamphlet called Common Sense, which is a name you'll want to associate with him. Not really a book, it's a pamphlet. It's an extended political argument. He calls it Common Sense. He writes it in January 1776 while America is having a great debate with itself. The debate's this: we're supposed to send delegates to Philadelphia again in June of 76. They're going to have on the table Declaration of Independence. Do I want to vote for a delegate that's going to go and be willing to go for independence if we have to? That's the great debate that the colonies are having. Because a lot of Americans, more than 200,000 I think, are loyalists out of the million person population. It's not a foregone. And some of them are like, they can't decide. The British church, the Anglican church in America, out of the pulpit every week, they're saying it is absolutely unchristian to rebel against our king. And the older English population, they have a sense of this is our king, we can't do this. And the church here in America has been touting the king. So he wants to fight that idea. He wants to win the debate for the Americans should pursue their own independence. They need to break off from corrupt Europe and completely start and build a new society based on new ideas, the ideas of the Enlightenment, to tell you the truth. I'll say this first. He's got to take on this religious argument that ministers are making over here, that they're quoting Peter and Paul in the New Testament, in which both Peter and Paul say that the duty of a Christian is to respect their government. In fact, I can't remember which one of them said that all governments are installed by God, and for whatever reason, even one that you can't imagine being installed by God. Why would that be the case? It's a mystery why we have this bad monarch. But whatever monarch you've got to listen to them because God's in control. Well, he's got to deal with that argument first. So he goes into the Old Testament, and he goes to the book of Samuel, when the Israelites they had been ruled by judges, which they selected out of their clans or tribes. But now the Israelites wanted a king. And Samuel tells them that God doesn't want them to have a king because kings are bad news. If you give all the power to one guy, it's not good. But the people insisted that they have a king, so they got Saul. So by bringing in the book of Samuel, he's able to counter one religious argument by finding another place in the Bible where that would work. So I guess you could say he's being rational in that regard. But the bigger thing I'd like you to come away with is he really hones in on the idea that the contest in the Americas, there's only one place where liberty exists in the world, all of Europe. In Europe, only England's got some liberty, but it's very limited. America has got an amazing amount of liberty among the people who live here. The rest of the world is enslaved, basically. By the way, that looks like in fact it is an F, but that's a lowercase s. They used an F or an S unless it was a plural. They put that. Okay, so the sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a county, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent. Now the next sentence. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity, everybody coming behind after us, are virtually involved in the contest and will be more or less affected even to the end of time. He also says that as of April 19th, we've entered a new era of politics because it's gone from argument to arms, and the king has attacked us egregiously. What he lays out in the whole thing is, if liberty is going to live, not only here in America, but even to the world, this is its one chance. You've got to keep it alive. You're going to die, yes, by going out. A lot of you are going to die by fighting. And we might have our homes burned. We might go through economic hardship. But when it's over and when we win, we'll have restored liberty not only for ourselves, but we will show the rest of the world what can be done with liberty. Pretty cool. What?
That this ideology works.
It does. Well, his ideas do. This thing gets reprinted 43 times. It's published in January 76. It's reprinted 43 times within a few months. And people are reading it and they're debating in the taverns, they're debating at churches, and there's a growing consensus that we're going to send delegates to Philadelphia who would vote for independence if it comes to it, if they don't hear anything from the king making it possible to negotiate. And so, that's why he's credited with a lot. The Congress meets in Philadelphia in latter June. They've decided they've gotten no redress from the king to make them think that they shouldn't not move forward. And so they put together a committee to write a Declaration of Independence explaining why we're doing this. It's all couched in political theory, really. The committees, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and I forget the other two guys. They had Thomas Jefferson write the first draft, and then they're going to edit it afterwards. Pretty cool, though. If you look at the political theory that's in it, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God, definitely Enlightenment style of expressing themselves, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. This isn't the whole thing, but this is a lot of it. This is Thomas Jefferson. By the way, Thomas Jefferson tried to get something in there against slavery. Benjamin Franklin says, if you go after slavery in this document too much, we're going to lose a lot of the southern states or colonies on this. But he does get some things in there that we build upon later on. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? Or is it written down? It's just self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are their life, liberty, a pursuit of happiness. Now, he switched lock there from property to pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. He's kind of getting locked there too. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right. This is the fruition of what John Locke had talked about back in 1670, that we have this right. Now you got to prove it, right? You got to do this thing. Well, we in America have laid down principles that we believe that we have. The revolutionary element of this document is probably up here. All men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights. Now, he doesn't get anything in their own slavery, but he has raised some ideas that Americans will come back. Don't we go back to this document a lot and say, are we living up to these principles? This becomes founding principles for the country. Very important. Here's what they finally say about the king. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, taking away our power, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Ooh, new name, colonies and states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. In the same document, something else is declared as being created. The United States of America. We, the United States of America, do this. So they've established a Congress, which they've said this exists, and now they've said this thing, the United States exists. So, is that it? Let's see what's left here. And now they sign their Declaration of Independence. Now they got to prove it, of course. They pull down, of course, the statue of King George around the city, and we now have a contest of arms.